And because the mass model was wrong, it thrusted the wrong way, and it started spinning. And so it spun fast enough that part of the spacecraft broke off, and that's a loss of mission. Many people were very broken up about this.
How to Science, a podcast from the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan, Season 2. With podcast host, LSA Professor Monica Deuce. This is me. The theme of the season is How to Science in Society. Season 2 explores the lives of scientists. We're interested in figuring out who are scientists, but also what it's like to do science in the context of a bigger society. After the story, I'll be back with a Q&A with the guest to talk more about how to science in society. Take a look through someone else's safety goggles.
My name's Jon Miller, and I'm an astrophysicist at the University of Michigan here. I'm an X-ray astronomer, and X-rays, they don't go through the atmosphere. So if we want to look at the universe in X-rays, we have to use satellites. And when you use satellites, that means they go up on rockets, and you're in the space environment, and there's a lot of risk and a lot of reward with this. To put something into space takes years of planning, and it's not like you can buy things off the shelf and use a MacBook and have it work in orbit, because you need, electronics that are radiation hardened and that can handle really cold temperatures and in really extreme environments. So there's a lot of prep that goes into these things, many, many years. And I was a part of a mission called Astro-H. And this was a joint venture of JAXA, which is the Japanese equivalent of NASA, and the European Space Agency, and I came in through NASA's partnership. And we'd been working on this mission for many years. I think I was involved for about 8. And this was really highly anticipated because it flew a new kind of detector that was going to change our view of how X-rays interact with matter and how we can see black holes and clusters of galaxies. And it was going to improve our knowledge by an order of magnitude or maybe more. And we had really been anticipating this for quite a long time. So when Astro-H launched in February 2016, it was 16 years of waiting since the first effort to do science with this new generation of detectors that's going to revolutionize things. The mission launched, and I remember sitting at the kitchen table, and the launch happens in one of the southernmost points in Japan, so it's like 3 a.m. The rest of the family were asleep, and they wanted a report as soon as they got up, but they couldn't quite make it to the sort of 3 a.m. launch window. And I'm online and texting with friends who were involved in the mission, and we're all as nervous as can possibly be about this, and everything goes off without a hitch. It's a completely beautiful launch, and the rocket makes it up, and you can see it really high into the air, and then they're following it from the ground and showing you sort of an animation of what's happening next. And there were moments where we were very nervous because the cowling, sort of the shell of the rocket, comes off once it's high up, because you really don't need any shielding from the atmosphere at one point. And that made everybody nervous, but that's what was supposed to happen. And it got into the right orbit, and everybody cheered. Everybody that I was chatting with online was delighted, and you could see cheers in the control room. Everything was just perfect. Several days passed, and everything was going according to schedule, and it looked great. And we kept getting positive reports from the team in Japan and the team in NASA. It wasn't until later that there were any indications of problems, and when the mission was lost, it was a complete surprise. It was a beautiful launch and a beautiful telescope as well. 9 times out of 10, it works perfectly. In late March, I was awakened by a call from a colleague, and she directs another X-ray observatory in orbit. And she said, "John, the government called me, and they say that where your satellite was, there are now 5 things floating around. Do you know anything about that?" And I said, "No, thank you for the call. How about I'll get back to you?" So I hung up, made a few calls to other people in the mission, and In these situations, people try very hard not to panic. Possibly, just a door on the side of the spacecraft has come off. And, the military can trace things that are only sort of a few centimeters in size. So maybe it isn't a full disaster yet. But the character of the response is that they weren't denying the worst case scenario to me when I asked, caused me to realize that there probably was a very major problem. And so I had to call my friend back and say, yes, I'm afraid that it looks like it could be a complete loss of mission, and I hope that none of this impacts your telescope. In the next several weeks, there were many efforts to try to recover the mission, and they ultimately proved unsuccessful. But, a large team of people worked very hard to try to get this thing back. My friends who are surgeons, they are made to read books about, how do disasters happen? And it's never just one thing. I think the lesson of those situations and this one is that it's never just one thing. There were 3 or 4 things in a chain that caused this problem. It was a combination of things that led to the loss of the telescope. One of them was very likely an incorrect mass model. So where the mass, or we use weight colloquially, of the spacecraft is, some parts of the spacecraft are heavier than others. And in our case, we had this boom that came off, sort of like the arm of a construction crane. And once you extend that boom, the center of mass of the spacecraft moves a little bit further out along that boom. When you write the code that describes how you should turn the spacecraft, you know that you have to change the center of mass once that boom is deployed. If you call that axis, say, an x-axis, you could have your code so that shifting in one direction is a positive motion or it's a negative motion. And I'm afraid the code had the wrong sign. So that caused part of the problem. It was also the case that it didn't lock on to positions correctly because of the star trackers. And also, had someone been sitting there, every second of those initial weeks, this error might have also been caught. But people need to, take a break after many days of nearly continuous effort. And so there was it's not one thing, it's many things. On one particular day, the star trackers weren't working, and the mass model had been wrong, and it wasn't being watched. And it got itself confused, and it tried to correct for its confusion about where it was pointing. And because the mass model was wrong, it thrusted the wrong way, and it started spinning. And once you get a spacecraft to spin past a certain rate, you don't recover. And so it spun fast enough that the solar panels flew off, and part of the spacecraft broke off. And that's a loss of mission. When you can no longer power the mission through the solar panels, there's nothing to be done. And many people were very broken up about this. In April, after the disaster in March, there was a national meeting for people who do X-ray astronomy in Naples, Florida. And everybody was quite sad and broken up, and we were kind of having a wake for the mission in the hotel. You could actually go out onto the beach in Naples, Florida, and watch the spacecraft tumble across the sky, and you could actually see it flicker as it tumbled past. And so this meeting where we were all expecting that we could tell you all of these amazing things that we had just discovered, instead we were able to go out with binoculars and see the tumble of the spacecraft from the beach. We all raised a glass of really good whiskey to Astro H and said farewell. But actually, I think the good part of that wake was that it helped you to realize that part of what's great about doing these things is the people you're working with. It's not just the hardware, of course. And as long as you still have these colleagues, the work will go on, the inquiry will go on. And I think partly in that moment, the idea of we can't just let this be the end, we have to charge forward, it kind of crystallized in that moment. But these things are tough, but when you do space missions and when you do astronomy that depends on space missions, you have to accept some of this risk. And, I lost some time and some science this way, but I think the most important thing about this is that this was one really interesting mission, and that there are lots of other missions that also provide critical information about the universe, and they are operated by NASA or by Japan or by the European Space Agency, either alone or in coordination. And there's lots of plans to continue doing these things, and especially this particular mission, Astro-H. The critical elements of it will be reassembled. The designs are finished, and so we expect to refly this in 2021. So we have a few years to wait and a few years to work really hard and think about the things that we can do well and the things that we can do better, and ultimately the science will get done. That's partly because NASA and JAXA and ESA are very committed to this kind of thing, and everybody involved with the project is really, really grateful for that.
Do you feel that the way you handle risk versus reward has changed throughout your career?
I don't think that I did. I think that I like what I do so much that I just plowed ahead almost, unchanged by these experiences. The brilliant thing about X-ray astronomy is that it's still a discovery space. It's much, much younger than traditional ground-based optical astronomy. You can go download data from a NASA public archive. Literally anybody can do this. It's public data in our field. And in the course of an afternoon, you could find something that nobody knew before. It's that fast. The barriers to entry are really low, and the chance to add something to the field that was not known before, there's a daily chance of doing that. And once you get used to that kind of ability, it's very hard to sort of throttle back and say, well, maybe I should be a little more cautious. And I'm afraid that I haven't. I really like X-ray astrophysics.
As a scientist, this is really fascinating to me. Thinking about this idea of the potentiality of our experiment versus its actualization. Can you tell me a little bit about how you think about potentiality versus actualization and how that frame of mind helps you maybe get through some of this setbacks or longer wait?
Yeah, it's interesting. I know exactly what you mean. When you're setting something up, there's that anticipation, and you know that there's tremendous potential, and what you get sometimes lives up to that potential. For me, I think there's many aspects to this. One of the important things that you have to do to be scientifically honest is know when your results have not lived up and report them truthfully, right? And when they do live up, that's terrific. You can play it up, you can send it to nature, you can make a great big deal about it. In terms of how do you structure your research, I personally know that I do some things that make clear, steady progress, and I do some things that are a big reach and have a high risk and high reward. But I try very hard not to put all of my effort into just the high risk things. So making sure to sort of spread your effort into things that are all going to make some amount of progress, and not putting all of your effort into one thing that could suddenly disappear, I think is important.
So would you say that's a way that you psychologically balance risk and reward in your experiments or in your projects, I guess?
I think that's part of it. I wonder if you feel the same. I think that most scientists are very, very optimistic people. I mean, hoping to sort of peel back what's underneath and push what's possible for humans to understand forward, I think is a very optimistic process.
That's interesting. I never thought about it in that way because I always feel I'm very pessimistic. But you're right, just the sheer thought that you can understand something that's actually very complex, that is very optimistic.
Well, I find it's easy to be skeptical about my own work, and I'll bet you're the same, because you don't want to make a mistake and you want to report it the right way. So it's sensible to be skeptical about your own work day to day. But I think in the broad scheme, the whole enterprise is really very optimistic. This particular telescope happened to fail, but we have many things that work really well and afford us a lot of opportunities. And I think about, I think one of the nice things about my field is maybe the way you sort of steel yourself against these events is hope. And you might sort of take the view that if you see these things happen a few times, I think it's hope that allows you to put more investment in and to march forward and continue to make new preparations and plan the next thing. And as we design and think about that, when we keep saying to ourselves, let's prepare to be surprised. We'll make a certain number of discoveries. There's some that we can anticipate, but let's also build in the capability to be surprised by things we haven't even guessed at yet. So oddly, I think hope helps to steel you against strange events like this.
Mm-hmm. So another thing that I found really fascinating when you were talking is that there's also risk and reward working with groups of scientists, different countries in this case, right? And all this really complicated engineering's completely different expertise. So how do you deal with that aspect of risky endeavor, which is just dealing with a large group of people and having to rely on them? You can't have control all aspects of the mission, right? So is it just like essentially hope and faith again in many aspects, and the idea that we're all scientists and we all excited and we're all in this together?
There are teams that build the spacecraft software and build the spacecraft hardware and focus on making sure that it knows where it points and that it knows where it is and how it ingests the data and telemeters it to the ground and on and on. It's so complex. Overall there was 200 or more people involved in all of this, and nobody was underemployed. I remember there were teams that worked 7 days a week for about 2 years to get to their particular endpoint. And you do have to put your faith in other teams doing the right thing. But I guess the way we try to mitigate the risk that you're talking about is in these meetings of the whole collaboration. We come together and you present your progress and your developments as honestly as possible. And you give people the opportunity to say, I think that's actually a problem. Sometimes the really different outside perspective is the one that really helps. So in that way, you try to mitigate the risk. But there is some risk. It is at some level a leap of faith.
What kind of advice would you give to earlier career scientists that are entering this field or that are dealing with projects where they have to balance risk and reward in their research?
I think what I would say is your chances of success are highest when you really believe in what you do and when you're really passionate about it and when you're willing to sort of go all in. I think that if you start from that point of view and go all in on it, you have a higher chance of success than if you hedge your bets or decide to pursue a field that might be maybe a little bit safer, but your heart is not in it. You never know when having your heart in something makes all the difference. So I would say if you're lucky enough to have a passion for one field, even if there's some risks, I think you should go in with everything on that.
What about joining our Facebook How to Science podcast group, where you can learn more about science, about how to science, and maybe get to talk to scientists about science news? Join the How to Science Facebook community, where we want to pop the bubble of the lab and see what it's like to do science in society. Make sure you subscribe. It's a hard word, subscribe. Okay. Subscribe to the podcast. Help your friends find out how to science by giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. And I honestly can barely pronounce the word algorithm, but something about the iTunes algorithm really helps other people that might never otherwise hear about it find it and listen to it. How to Science. How to Science. How to Science.
The How to Science podcast is recorded at WCBN FM, the student-run, community-supported radio station on the campus of the University of Michigan.
Astrophysicists are the coolest. I'm sorry, I'm so jealous.